That was actually a kind of perfect segue into one of your previous posts on the overview for the three types of marketplace shifts and notably changing without breaking the marketplace. So I'd love to kind of jump into that. And you did mention some of the, the three main shifts that you laid out in the post. So if you could maybe walk us through that, I think that would be super helpful.
Sure. So I wrote this post a lot because I've been experiencing these things, these changes that a marketplace needs to make. Sometimes it's imposed on the marketplace from an external perspective. Sometimes some strategy issue makes you need to make a meaningful shift. And definitely, I think I wrote this early on in COVID, or when we were seeing these, and I thought it might be helpful to other companies as well. So I basically, early on, when you're building a marketplace, you can try anything. There's really nothing to lose. But once you've created something that works, a marketplace is a pretty delicate thing. There's a balance there. There's trust that needs to be on both sides of the marketplace. There's the right amount of value that everybody's getting and feels like a part of the marketplace and beholden to each other. And that can be delicate. But a company can't keep things as they are all the time, and you've got to change and evolve as a marketplace. And some marketplaces see that when they're becoming more managed. Some companies see that when they're responding to competition, or when they want to increase the consumer experience or change the supplier experience. And what I found is that it's important to understand the difference between product changes that maybe aren't that important in the larger strategic sense, or rather in the, it's not fair to say strategic, I think maybe marketplace dynamic sense, that they don't actually change the dynamic of what's happening in the marketplace, and the ones that do. And kind of a framework that's been helpful for me, and I thought, and based on the conversations have been helpful for other people too, is to think about these shifts as either a value shift, a control shift, or a risk shift. And if you have one of these, if you're able to identify that your change is going to be one or more of these types of shifts, then it's really something to pay attention to. And so a value shift is when one of the parties gets less or different value, usually less value, out of the participation in the marketplace. Very typical, this can be a pricing change, or how you distribute fees or something like that. A control shift is when one party is granted more power or less power or control, right, at the expense of another. And this is very common when marketplaces move to a more and more managed structure. So if a marketplace starts from a light, kind of a light marketplace, but then it says, no, I've got to really standardize how inventory quality is on my marketplace, or how my refund policy works, or onboarding or whatever. These are control shifts that really matter typically to the supply side, but they could be in other places. And then a risk shift is when risk moves from one party to another. And I think that in the post I used FAIR as the example, because I thought it was a really interesting one, where FAIR takes on basically free returns and takes on a lot of risk there. But the more common example of this in marketplaces is usually when there's a change in like chargeback policy for the supply side or something like that, where perhaps in the beginning, marketplaces often they don't even deal with it. They just like take on the risk, take on the issue. And then over time, they kind of start creating these policies that move and distribute risk differently. So from the company taking on the risk, usually it kind of moves to the suppliers. These can be really meaningful. And if you recognize them, then taking them slow, being very thoughtful, can save a lot of grief for a company. I think one of the nicest examples that I put in the post is one that with Airbnb's Instant Book, right? And that's a really nice control shift. And it demonstrates this idea of something that wasn't obvious at the time. Now it's hard to imagine an Airbnb without this Instant Book. But at the time, this gave a lot of control to supply. And supply said, I can accept you, I cannot accept you. I have time to like vet the customer. I can talk to them. I can decide who's going to stay in my place. And you can obviously understand why that's so meaningful to people doing home sharing, especially when the concept was new. But Airbnb realized that it needed over time to make this shift because they wanted to be a different type of marketplace. They needed to provide a different type of customer experience in order to compete. And talking to a lot of people that were a part of that change, it maybe even went a little bit too slow because they realized that what they were making a really significant shift. Yeah, I guess that's kind of the general taxonomy, and I talk about some of the failure modes, some of the ways that companies can, some of the problems that companies typically face when they're making this type of change.